What if the story of ancient warriors, sacred rituals, and lost kingdoms was hidden inside you? Not in dusty books, not carved in ancient stones, but right there in your very DNA. Imagine every heartbeat carrying echoes from distant ancestors, their traditions embedded deep within your genetic code. Science has discovered that history isn't just written in scrolls or etched in ruins. It's woven into the strands of our DNA. This isn't just about family trees or ancestry tests. This is about how the legacy of the Celts, their traditions, their migrations, and their way of life, lives on within us, silently shaping who we are today. The Celts, a name that evokes images of fierce warriors, mystical druids, and vibrant cultures spread across Europe. But here's the first twist. There was no single Celtic tribe. The term Celtic wasn't even used by them. It was coined by the Greeks to describe diverse groups scattered from Ireland to Anatolia. They didn't leave behind written records, no grand historical texts to explain their way of life. Yet, despite this silence, we can still hear their story through the language of our genes. Our DNA has preserved their history, traditions, and even their secrets, hidden within us for thousands of years. So how does science read these ancient stories? Imagine DNA as a time machine. When scientists extract ancient DNA from bones or teeth buried for centuries, they are unlocking genetic diaries written long before paper existed. Using advanced techniques, researchers have examined remains from elite Hallstatt burials in Germany, the Unauthorized tribe in the UK, and extensive studies like the Wellcome Trust's British Isles project. This isn't just about tracing where people came from. It's about uncovering who they were, how they lived, how they loved, and how their societies were structured. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. There's no such thing as a single Celtic gene. That's right, no universal genetic marker defines someone as Celtic. Instead, what we find is incredible diversity. For example, the Cornish are genetically closer to the English than to the Welsh, while the Scots and Irish show distinct genetic patterns, despite both being labeled as Celtic. The common thread isn't a gene but a shared cultural identity, passed through language, art, and tradition rather than just blood. And now comes a revelation that flips historical assumptions. DNA from ancient elite Celtic burials suggests that power might have been passed down not through fathers and sons, as many believed, but through mothers and their brothers. Yes, matrilineal succession. In burial sites like Eberding and Hochdorf and Asperg-Grafenbuhl in Germany, DNA analysis revealed an avuncular relationship, uncle to nephew, suggesting that inheritance and leadership were matrilineally linked. This challenges the classic image of male-dominated warrior societies. Celtic women weren't just influential, they were central to dynasties, wielding power that shaped the course of history. But that's not all. DNA has confirmed the ancient practice of fosterage, where children were raised by families outside their biological homes, often to strengthen political alliances. In the Unauthorized tribe of Britain, scientists discovered that some individuals buried side by side weren't blood relatives. This wasn't random. It reflects a complex social structure where loyalty and kinship extended beyond biology. Fosterage wasn't just about raising a child. It was about weaving a web of alliances, trust, and power across tribes and territories. And then there's the question of migrations. For centuries, historians debated where the Celts originated. Was it Central Europe? The Iberian Peninsula? DNA has provided surprising answers. Genetic links show strong connections from northern Spain to Ireland, suggesting that the spread of Celtic culture wasn't just through land migrations but also across maritime routes. Elite individuals buried 100 kilometers apart in Germany were found to be closely related, revealing a level of transregional mobility and interconnectedness that was previously unimagined. But the most captivating part is how DNA reflects ancient spiritual traditions. In burial sites like Magdalenenburg, genetic patterns reveal not just family ties but sacred rituals. Some individuals show signs of inbreeding, possibly to preserve so-called sacred bloodlines. Others were buried with elaborate grave goods, indicating their status as spiritual leaders or even revered ancestors. These weren't just burials, they were acts of devotion, deeply intertwined with Celtic beliefs about life, death, and the afterlife. Even today, the Celtic legacy lives on, not just in cultural festivals, traditional music, or ancient languages, but in our very genes. The genetic markers of these ancient people have traveled far and wide, reaching places like America and Australia through migrations. Some people carry Celtic DNA without even realizing it. Every time someone celebrates Samhain, listens to traditional Gaelic music, or speaks a Celtic language, they are echoing the voices of ancestors whose DNA still whispers through time. But here's the kicker. What we thought we knew about the Celts is often wrong. There's no universal Celtic bloodline. The Vikings didn't erase populations. They merged with them. The Welsh are more genetically connected to Britain's earliest settlers than the English are. And astonishingly, some ancient Celtic sites have stronger genetic ties to Italy than to Ireland. So, what does this all mean? Your DNA isn't just a scientific code. It's a saga, a story of migrations, battles, alliances, and traditions that shaped the world. It's living history, written in bloodlines that stretch back thousands of years. Maybe you carry a fragment of that story. Maybe your genes hold the echoes of warriors, druids, or chieftains long forgotten. When we think of ancient Celtic traditions, images of mystical rituals, fierce warriors, and sacred druidic ceremonies often come to mind. But what if the true key to understanding these ancient customs isn't found in old legends or faded artifacts? What if it's hidden within us, encoded in our DNA? The relationship between Celtic genetics and cultural practices isn't just a fascinating topic. It's a bridge connecting the ancient world to the present, revealing how deep-rooted traditions have been passed down, not just through stories, but through our very genes. Celtic society wasn't just about battles and conquests. It was built on complex social structures, where family ties, inheritance, and leadership were deeply influenced by biological relationships. Recent genetic studies have unearthed something extraordinary, a practice of matrilineal succession within Celtic elites. In elite burial sites like Eberding and Hochdorf and Asperg-Grafenbuhl in Germany, DNA analysis revealed an avuncular relationship between two of the richest burials, meaning the leadership likely passed from an uncle to his sister's son. This isn't just a random family connection. It suggests that Celtic dynasties may have favored matrilineal inheritance, where power flowed through the female line, challenging the long-held belief that ancient societies were strictly patriarchal. This genetic discovery aligns with Roman accounts describing powerful Celtic women, often dismissed as exaggerations. But now, science confirms that women weren't just influential. They were central to political and social structures. In some cases, they were the very backbone of dynasties, ensuring continuity through their lineage. This explains why women in Celtic mythology are often portrayed as warriors, leaders, and spiritual guides, roles that weren't just symbolic but reflected real societal dynamics. But the influence of DNA on Celtic traditions doesn't stop at leadership. Consider the practice of fosterage, a system where children were raised in households other than their own, often to strengthen political alliances. This wasn't merely a cultural ritual. Genetic evidence shows that fostered children left biological markers across regions, creating webs of kinship that transcended bloodlines. In the Durotriges tribe of Britain, for example, scientists found individuals buried together who weren't biologically related, yet their graves indicated deep social bonds. This practice ensured loyalty between tribes and spread genetic diversity, weaving a complex tapestry of relationships that shaped Celtic society. Then there's the connection between DNA and sacred rituals. In burial sites like Magdalenenberg, genetic patterns reveal not just family ties but spiritual hierarchies. Some individuals show signs of deliberate inbreeding, an unusual practice often linked to maintaining pure bloodlines, possibly for religious or royal purposes. Others were buried with elaborate grave goods, suggesting roles as spiritual leaders or revered ancestors. Their genetic markers, combined with archaeological evidence, paint a picture of rituals deeply intertwined with both lineage and legacy. Migration patterns, too, offer a window into how Celtic traditions spread and evolved. DNA analysis reveals that the Celts didn't emerge from a single homeland but from interconnected regions stretching from Iberia to Central Europe. Genetic links between northern Spain and Ireland, for example, suggest that maritime routes played a crucial role in the spread of Celtic culture. This mobility didn't just carry people. It carried languages, beliefs, and customs, embedding them into the genetic fabric of each new region. Interestingly, while we often imagine the Celts as isolated tribes, genetic evidence tells a story of widespread connections. Elite individuals buried more than 100 kilometers apart in Germany were found to be closely related, indicating not just long-distance travel but a shared cultural identity reinforced by biological ties. This network of kinship helped maintain traditions across vast territories, creating a cohesive Celtic culture despite regional differences. What's even more remarkable is how these ancient traditions persist today. Celtic festivals like Samhain, which evolved into modern Halloween, or the enduring popularity of Gaelic languages and traditional music, aren't just cultural relics. They are echoes of practices rooted in ancient social structures, many of which are now confirmed through genetic research. The resilience of these traditions, despite centuries of change, speaks to their deep integration into both cultural and biological heritage. And here's the most surprising revelation: genetics also challenges long-standing historical narratives. For instance, the belief that Anglo-Saxon invasions wiped out earlier populations in Britain has been debunked. DNA shows that Anglo-Saxons intermarried with local communities, blending traditions rather than erasing them. Similarly, while the Vikings left a significant genetic mark in places like Orkney, their impact was through integration, not replacement. This genetic blending preserved Celtic customs, even as new cultural layers were added. Ultimately, Celtic DNA is more than a record of ancestry. It's a living archive of traditions, migrations, and social structures that shaped ancient Europe. It reveals how leadership passed through maternal lines, how fosterage created lasting alliances, and how rituals were deeply connected to both spirituality and lineage. These discoveries don't just rewrite history books, they redefine how we understand the connection between who we are and where we come from. When we think of the ancient Celts, we often picture a mysterious people surrounded by myths, legends, and heroic tales. But what if the most compelling story isn't found in old manuscripts or ancient artifacts? What if it's written within us, etched deep into our DNA? The genetic legacy of the Celts doesn't just tell us where they lived or who they were. It reveals how their movements shaped the very fabric of Europe. Celtic migrations weren't just random waves of people moving across the continent. They were part of a much larger, complex pattern that left distinct genetic footprints still visible today. Recent studies of ancient DNA have uncovered fascinating insights into how the Celts spread from Central Europe to the Atlantic coasts, influencing regions from Ireland to Spain. For example, genetic data shows strong links between the Celtic populations of Ireland and the Iberian Peninsula. This suggests that ancient maritime routes were more than just trade highways. They were channels for cultural exchange, language, and even bloodlines. Contrary to older theories that suggested a single Celtic homeland in Central Europe, DNA evidence paints a different picture. The Celts didn't emerge from one specific region but evolved through continuous migrations and intermingling with local populations. This means that the people we call Celts weren't a homogeneous group but a network of communities connected by shared traditions, languages, and, crucially, genetic ties. One of the most striking revelations comes from genetic studies in Britain. For years, historians debated whether the Celtic culture arrived through mass migrations or gradual cultural diffusion. The answer: both. DNA shows that while there were waves of newcomers, especially during the Bronze and Iron Ages, these migrations didn't wipe out existing populations. Instead, newcomers intermarried with local communities, blending their genes and traditions. This genetic fusion helped spread Celtic culture organically, rather than through violent conquests alone. Interestingly, when researchers examined the DNA of ancient Celtic tribes like the Durotriges in southern England, they found clear patterns of mobility. While men often migrated between regions, women tended to stay within their ancestral communities. This metrolocal system, where men moved to join their wives' families, helped maintain strong local traditions while also facilitating connections between distant tribes. It's a reminder that migration isn't just about movement, it's about relationships, marriages, and the blending of lives across borders. Another fascinating discovery lies in the genetic markers of elite burials across Europe. In sites like Magdalenenburg in Germany, DNA evidence revealed biological relationships between individuals buried hundreds of kilometers apart. This suggests that Celtic elites were part of expansive networks, maintaining family ties over vast distances. Such connections would have been crucial for securing political alliances and trade routes, reinforcing the idea that Celtic society was both locally rooted and globally connected. But how do these ancient migrations continue to influence us today? The answer is in our genes. Modern populations in regions like Ireland, Scotland, and northern Spain still carry strong genetic signatures linked to ancient Celtic groups. In fact, genetic studies show that people in Western Britain share more DNA with populations in the Basque region of Spain than with those in eastern England. This isn't just a historical curiosity. It's living proof of ancient migrations that shaped the genetic landscape of modern Europe. Even the distribution of certain genetic traits offers clues about Celtic movements. The high frequency of the Y chromosome haplogroup R1b in Western Europe, especially in Ireland, suggests a common ancestry dating back to the Bronze Age. This haplogroup spread aligns closely with the expansion of Celtic-speaking peoples, hinting at a deep connection between language, culture, and genetics. Celtic migrations also left their mark on more than just DNA. They influenced place names, linguistic patterns, and even traditional customs. For example, the Celtic festival of Samhain, which evolved into modern Halloween, was celebrated across regions connected through genetic and cultural ties. The spread of such traditions mirrors the genetic pathways of ancient migrations, showing how culture and biology often travel hand in hand. Moreover, genetic research challenges some long-held assumptions about ancient migrations. Take the case of the Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britain. While historical accounts suggested that the Anglo-Saxons replaced the native Celtic populations, DNA evidence tells a different story. Rather than being wiped out, the local Celtic communities integrated with the newcomers, preserving much of their genetic heritage. This pattern of integration rather than replacement seems to be a recurring theme in European history. The Norse Viking influence in the British Isles offers another example. In places like Orkney, up to 25% of modern DNA comes from Norwegian ancestors. However, this doesn't mean the Vikings replaced the local population. Instead, they settled, married, and blended with the indigenous people, creating a genetic mosaic that reflects both Celtic and Norse heritage. Perhaps the most surprising finding is the absence of a clear genetic signature from the Danish Vikings in England, despite their historical dominance in the region known as the Danelaw. This suggests that cultural influence doesn't always leave a strong genetic mark, or that the genetic legacy was diluted over time through intermarriage with local populations. What does all this tell us about the Celts? Their migrations were more than just historical events. They were dynamic processes that shaped the genetic and cultural landscapes of Europe. The Celts weren't a static people confined to one region. They were explorers, traders, and settlers whose influence stretched from the Atlantic coast to the heart of Central Europe. And their legacy lives on. Whether in the DNA of modern populations, the languages we speak, or the festivals we celebrate, the echoes of Celtic migrations continue to resonate. It's a reminder that history isn't just something we read about in books. It's written in our very genes, connecting us to a past that's both ancient and enduring. The story of the Celts isn't just preserved in ancient texts or carved into standing stones. It's woven into the very fabric of our DNA. One of the most fascinating discoveries of recent genetic research is the powerful connection between Celtic DNA and ancient cultural traditions, particularly in the way family and leadership were structured. Understanding this link gives us a new lens through which to view Celtic society, revealing how deeply rooted their customs were, not just in belief systems but in biological lineage. One of the most remarkable revelations from ancient DNA studies is the evidence of matrilineal dynasties within early Celtic elites. Traditionally, many ancient societies are thought to have passed power down through male lines, with kingship and leadership inherited from father to son. However, Celtic DNA tells a different story. In burial sites like Eberdingen-Hochdorf and Asperg-Grafenbuhl in southern Germany, genetic analysis uncovered an unexpected relationship, a maternal uncle and his sister's son, known as an avuncular relationship. This suggests that power may have been passed through the maternal line, with leadership flowing from a man to his sister's son rather than his own child. This matrilineal pattern isn't just an isolated case. It's supported by multiple findings across elite Celtic burial sites. For example, the princely burial mound at Magdalenenburg revealed a network of biological relationships connecting individuals across different sites, some separated by over 100 kilometers. These connections weren't random. They reflected deliberate familial alliances maintained through maternal ties. Such a system would have reinforced strong family networks, ensuring that leadership remained within a trusted lineage while also forging bonds between distant communities. But why would the Celts prioritize maternal lines in their leadership structures? The answer may lie in the unique social dynamics of Celtic societies. In many cultures, paternity can be uncertain, but maternity is undeniable. By tracing lineage through the mother, Celtic elites could ensure that their bloodline remained pure and uncontested. This system also empowered women, giving them a central role in the transmission of status and authority. Far from being passive figures, women in Celtic societies often held significant influence, not just as mothers but as political actors in their own right. Ancient Roman historians, often fascinated by the barbarian tribes they encountered, noted the prominence of women in Celtic societies. They wrote about fierce warrior queens, like Boudica, who led revolts against Roman rule. While these accounts were sometimes exaggerated, DNA evidence now supports the idea that women played a central role, not just in warfare but in the very structure of Celtic leadership. Another intriguing aspect of Celtic kinship revealed by DNA is the practice of fosterage. In many Celtic societies, children, especially boys destined for leadership, were often raised not by their biological parents but by foster families. This wasn't just a matter of convenience. It was a strategic practice designed to build alliances and strengthen social bonds. Fosterage created networks of loyalty that extended beyond blood ties, weaving together different clans and tribes into a cohesive social fabric. Genetic studies provide tangible evidence of this tradition. In burial sites like Grafenball, researchers discovered individuals buried together who shared no biological relationship, suggesting that these people may have been connected through fosterage rather than family. This system of raising children in allied households helped maintain peace, secure political alliances, and ensure the continuity of cultural traditions across generations. The combination of matrilineal succession and fosterage reflects a society deeply invested in maintaining both biological and social continuity. Leadership wasn't just about who had the strongest claim by birth. It was about who could uphold the values, traditions, and alliances that defined the community. This focus on interconnectedness, both through blood and through social bonds, is part of what made Celtic society so resilient and dynamic. Interestingly, these kinship practices also influenced how the Celts viewed land and property. In many ancient cultures, land ownership was tied to paternal inheritance. But in Celtic societies, land was often held collectively by clans, with inheritance passing through maternal lines or being managed by the broader kin group. This communal approach to property reinforced the importance of family networks and ensured that wealth and resources remained within the community, rather than being concentrated in the hands of a single male heir. DNA analysis has even shed light on how these kinship systems affected marriage practices. In some Celtic regions, exogamy, marrying outside one's immediate community, was common, likely as a strategy to forge alliances with neighboring tribes. This practice is reflected in genetic data showing a high degree of mobility, particularly among men, who often moved to join their wives' families. At the same time, women tended to stay within their ancestral communities, preserving local traditions and maintaining the continuity of cultural practices. One of the most striking examples of this pattern comes from the Durotriges tribe in southern England. Genetic evidence from their burial sites reveals that while men frequently came from different regions, women often shared close maternal ancestry, indicating that they remained rooted in their home communities. This matrilocal system helped sustain cultural traditions, as women served as the primary custodians of language, rituals, and local customs. The genetic legacy of these kinship systems is still visible today. Modern populations in regions historically associated with Celtic cultures, such as Ireland, Scotland, and parts of France, show strong genetic continuity with their ancient ancestors. This continuity isn't just a matter of shared DNA. It reflects the enduring influence of social structures that prioritized family, community, and cultural cohesion. Moreover, genetic studies reveal that even as Celtic societies evolved and interacted with other cultures, through Roman conquest, Germanic migrations, and Viking invasions, their core kinship practices left a lasting imprint. In many cases, these traditions adapted to new circumstances, blending with the customs of incoming populations while retaining distinct elements of Celtic identity. What's truly remarkable is how this ancient system of kinship has echoes in modern times. The importance of extended family networks, the value placed on community ties, and the role of women as cultural anchors are all aspects of Celtic society that continue to resonate today. Whether in the strong sense of clan identity in Scotland or the emphasis on family heritage in Ireland, the legacy of Celtic kinship lives on, not just in history books, but in the very DNA of the people who carry that heritage. Celtic DNA doesn't just tell us where people came from. It reveals how they lived, loved, and led. It shows us a society where power was rooted in family, where women held central roles, and where leadership was as much about nurturing relationships as it was about wielding authority. Through the lens of genetics, we gain not just a scientific understanding of the past, but a deeper appreciation for the rich, complex tapestry of human history woven by the Celts. The journey of uncovering Celtic history often feels like piecing together an ancient puzzle, where each discovery reveals a part of a rich, complex story. While artifacts, language, and legends have long guided our understanding of the Celts, recent advances in genetic research have added a powerful new piece to this puzzle: DNA. By analyzing ancient genetic markers, scientists have unearthed fascinating insights into how Celtic populations migrated, mixed, and evolved over time. This isn't just a tale of who the Celts were. It's a story of where they came from, how they moved, and the lasting legacy they left behind. The roots of the Celtic people stretch deep into prehistory, intertwined with the broader narrative of Europe's ancient populations. For a long time, historians believed that Celtic culture originated in Central Europe, spreading westward through waves of migration during the Iron Age. But DNA evidence paints a more nuanced picture. Genetic data suggests that the foundations of Celtic identity were laid long before the Iron Age, rooted in the populations that inhabited Western Europe after the last Ice Age, around 12,000 years ago. This ancient connection is particularly evident in regions along the Atlantic coast, from the Iberian Peninsula to the British Isles. Studies of mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down through the maternal line, and Y chromosome markers, inherited from fathers, reveal striking genetic similarities among populations in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and northern Spain. These regions, often referred to as the Atlantic facade, share a deep ancestral heritage that predates the spread of Celtic languages and culture. This suggests that instead of being the result of a massive migration from Central Europe, Celtic identity may have emerged from the cultural and linguistic evolution of already connected Atlantic communities. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from the genetic links between the modern populations of the British Isles and the Basque people of northern Spain. Despite the Basque speaking a non-Indo-European language, their genetic markers closely resemble those of ancient Celtic regions. This points to a common ancestry dating back to the post-Ice Age recolonization of Europe, long before the advent of Celtic culture. It's a reminder that cultural identities, like the Celts, can arise from shared roots, even when languages and traditions diverge over time. But the story doesn't end with these ancient connections. As the Bronze Age unfolded, bringing with it new technologies, trade routes, and social structures, the Celtic world began to take shape. Genetic evidence from this period reveals waves of migration and admixture, particularly with populations carrying steppe ancestry, a genetic signature linked to the pastoralist cultures of the Pontic-Caspian steppe. This influx of steppe ancestry introduced not just new genes but also new cultural elements, such as metallurgy, horse domestication, and possibly early forms of the Indo-European languages, which include Celtic. Interestingly, the spread of this steppe ancestry wasn't uniform. In places like Ireland and Western Scotland, the genetic impact was relatively modest compared to regions like Central Europe. This suggests that while these migrations influenced Celtic societies, they didn't replace the existing populations. Instead, Celtic culture emerged from the blending of ancient Atlantic traditions with new influences from migrating groups, a dynamic fusion rather than a simple conquest. As the Iron Age dawned, the Celts expanded across Europe, leaving behind a rich archaeological legacy marked by distinctive art, burial practices, and settlements. Genetic studies of Iron Age remains from sites like Holstadt in Austria and La Tène in Switzerland, often considered the heartlands of early Celtic culture, show a genetic profile similar to contemporary populations in France, Germany, and Britain. This genetic continuity challenges the traditional view of large-scale migrations driving the spread of Celtic culture. Instead, it suggests that cultural diffusion, trade, and local adaptations played significant roles in the Celtic expansion. One of the most fascinating aspects of Celtic migrations is the evidence of long-distance connections across Europe. For example, DNA analysis has uncovered biological relationships between individuals buried in elite tombs over 100 kilometers apart, such as the princely burials of Eberdingen-Hochdorf and Magdalenenburg in southern Germany. These connections weren't just random, they reflected deliberate alliances, possibly maintained through marriage, fosterage, and trade networks that spanned vast distances. These long-distance ties are further supported by isotopic analysis, which measures chemical signatures in human remains to determine where individuals grew up. In many Celtic burials, isotopic data reveals that people often traveled far from their places of birth, suggesting a high degree of mobility, especially among the elite. This mobility wasn't just about exploration, it was a vital part of Celtic society, helping to forge alliances, exchange goods, and spread cultural practices across regions. The Celtic migrations didn't stop within Europe. By the 3rd century BCE, Celtic tribes had crossed the Alps, establishing settlements in northern Italy, known as Cisalpine Gaul. They even ventured as far as Anatolia, in modern-day Turkey, where a group known as the Galatians settled after being invited by local rulers to serve as mercenaries. Remarkably, genetic traces of these migrations can still be found in modern populations, highlighting the far-reaching influence of Celtic expansion. However, the genetic legacy of the Celts is not just about where they went, it's also about how they mixed with the people they encountered. In many cases, Celtic migrants integrated with local populations, creating diverse communities with blended cultural and genetic identities. This is evident in regions like central France, where ancient DNA reveals a mix of Celtic, Mediterranean, and local genetic influences, reflecting centuries of interaction through trade, marriage, and conquest. One of the enduring mysteries of Celtic history is the fate of their culture following the Roman conquest. When the Romans expanded into Celtic territories, they brought new administrative systems, languages, and technologies. Yet, despite the cultural shifts, genetic evidence shows a remarkable degree of continuity in the populations of former Celtic regions. In Britain, for example, studies reveal that the genetic makeup of the population remained largely consistent from the Iron Age through the Roman period, suggesting that Romanization was more of a cultural overlay than a complete demographic transformation. Even after the fall of the Roman Empire, Celtic migrations continued to shape Europe. The spread of Gaelic culture from Ireland to Scotland, the movement of Britons to Brittany in France, and the enduring presence of Celtic languages in Wales and Cornwall all reflect the resilience and adaptability of Celtic identity. Genetic studies of modern populations in these regions reveal strong continuity with their ancient ancestors, underscoring the deep roots of Celtic heritage. Today, the echoes of these ancient migrations can still be seen in the genetic diversity of Europe. Modern genetic maps show subtle but distinct patterns that reflect the movements of Celtic peoples over thousands of years. For example, populations in Wales and Western Ireland show genetic signatures that are more closely aligned with ancient European hunter-gatherers and early farmers, while regions like Eastern England have higher levels of ancestry from later migrations, such as the Anglo-Saxons. What makes this story so compelling is that it's not just about the distant past. The genetic legacy of the Celts lives on in millions of people today, woven into the DNA of populations across Europe and beyond. Each genetic marker is like a thread in a vast tapestry, connecting us to the lives, journeys, and traditions of those who came before us. In the end, Celtic migrations weren't just movements of people, they were movements of ideas, languages, and cultures. Through the lens of genetics, we can see how these migrations shaped the course of history, blending ancient traditions with new influences to create the rich mosaic of European heritage. It's a reminder that our identities are not fixed points in time but evolving stories, written in both our history and our genes. Exploring the mysteries of the Celtic world often feels like unraveling a story woven through both time and space. One of the most fascinating threads in this story is the discovery of how Celtic populations, spread across Europe, were connected through intricate migration routes and patterns of settlement. While archaeology and historical records have given us glimpses into this ancient past, it's the revolutionary insights from DNA that now allow us to trace the paths the Celts walked, the people they met, and how their legacy continues to influence modern populations. When we think of Celtic migrations, it's easy to picture vast waves of warriors moving across Europe. However, recent genetic studies paint a more nuanced picture, one of gradual movements, complex interactions, and the blending of cultures over thousands of years. At the heart of this story is the concept of population continuity, which helps us understand how ancient populations didn't just vanish with time but evolved, carrying their genetic signatures into future generations. One of the key revelations from DNA analysis is the deep-rooted connection between modern Celtic-speaking populations, like those in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, and the people who inhabited these regions thousands of years ago. Genetic markers passed down through generations reveal that the core of the Celtic gene pool has remained remarkably stable, even through periods of significant cultural change, such as the Roman conquest and later migrations. This continuity suggests that while languages, customs, and political systems may have shifted, the people themselves maintained strong biological ties to their ancient ancestors. The story begins after the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, when humans began to repopulate Europe. The genetic legacy of these early settlers is still evident in modern Celtic regions, particularly in western parts of the British Isles. For example, studies of mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited through the maternal line, and Y chromosome markers, passed down from fathers to sons, show that people in regions like Western Ireland and the Scottish Highlands share genetic signatures with ancient hunter-gatherer populations who first settled there thousands of years ago. As time progressed, new waves of migration brought fresh influences. One of the most significant was the arrival of Neolithic farmers from the Near East around 4000 BCE. These early agricultural communities left a strong genetic imprint across Europe, including in Celtic regions. However, the extent of this influence varied. In some areas, such as Ireland and Western Britain, the genetic contribution from these Neolithic migrants was substantial but didn't completely replace the earlier hunter-gatherer populations. Instead, it led to a blending of ancestries, creating a genetic mosaic that would form the foundation for later Celtic societies. The Bronze Age marked another critical chapter in the story of Celtic migrations. This era saw increased movement across Europe, driven by the rise of long-distance trade networks, the spread of metalworking technologies, and social transformations. Genetic evidence from Bronze Age burials reveals that people were traveling and interacting across vast distances, with significant gene flow between regions as far apart as the Iberian Peninsula and the British Isles. Interestingly, this period also saw the arrival of steppe ancestry in Europe, a genetic signature linked to pastoralist groups from the Pontic-Caspian steppe region. This influx had a profound impact on the genetic landscape of Europe, introducing new lineages and possibly influencing the spread of Indo-European languages, which include Celtic. However, the genetic data shows that while steppe ancestry became prominent in many parts of Central and Eastern Europe, its presence was more diluted in the Atlantic regions where Celtic cultures flourished. This suggests that while the Celts were part of this broader Indo-European expansion, they also retained strong connections to their earlier ancestral roots. As the Iron Age dawned, the Celts emerged as one of the dominant cultural forces in Europe. Their influence stretched from the British Isles to the Iberian Peninsula, across France, and into Central Europe. But how did they spread so widely? Genetic studies provide crucial insights. Instead of large-scale, population-replacing migrations, the expansion of Celtic culture appears to have been driven by smaller groups of people moving into new areas, intermarrying with local populations, and sharing their language and traditions. This pattern of cultural diffusion is evident in regions like Gaul, modern-day France, where ancient DNA reveals a blend of local and incoming Celtic genetic markers. The same is true in northern Italy, where the Celts established strongholds during the Latine period. Genetic data from these regions shows continuity with earlier populations, suggesting that the Celts integrated with the communities they encountered rather than completely displacing them. One of the most compelling examples of Celtic migration comes from the story of the Galatians, Celtic tribes who migrated all the way to Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, in the 3rd century BCE. Historical records describe their movement across the Balkans and their settlement in central Anatolia, where they maintained their distinct cultural identity for centuries. Genetic studies of ancient remains from this region reveal traces of Western European ancestry, consistent with their Celtic origins, alongside local genetic influences. This highlights the dynamic nature of Celtic migrations, where mobility, adaptation, and integration were key features. The genetic legacy of these migrations is still visible today. Modern populations in regions historically associated with Celtic culture, such as Brittany in France, Galicia in Spain, and parts of the British Isles, carry genetic signatures that reflect this ancient past. These signatures are not uniform but show variations that correspond to historical patterns of movement and interaction. For example, people in Western Ireland have genetic markers that link them closely to ancient Atlantic populations, while those in Eastern Britain show more influence from later migrations, such as the Anglo-Saxons. But the story of Celtic migrations isn't just about the movement of people. It's also about the movement of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. The Celts were skilled traders, artisans, and warriors, and their network spanned much of Europe. Genetic studies of ancient burial sites often reveal individuals who were not local to the area where they were buried, suggesting that mobility was a key feature of Celtic life. This mobility facilitated the exchange of goods, such as metalwork and pottery, as well as the spread of artistic styles and religious beliefs. Interestingly, genetic data also sheds light on social structures within Celtic communities. In some elite burials, DNA analysis reveals close biological relationships between individuals buried in different regions, suggesting that alliances through marriage and kinship played a role in maintaining political power and social cohesion. This is particularly evident in the princely burials of the Hallstatt and Latin cultures, where shared ancestry links elites across vast distances. Another fascinating aspect of Celtic migrations is the evidence for long-distance female mobility. In many ancient burial sites, isotopic analysis, which measures chemical signatures in bones and teeth to determine geographic origins, shows that women often came from distant regions. This suggests that marriage alliances were used to forge connections between different Celtic groups, reinforcing political ties and spreading cultural practices. Despite these extensive migrations and interactions, one of the most striking findings from genetic research is the resilience of Celtic identity. Even in regions that experienced significant external influence, such as Roman-occupied Britain or Gaul under the Roman Empire, the genetic continuity of local populations remained strong. This continuity underscores the idea that cultural identity is not solely determined by genetics but is also shaped by language, traditions, and shared history. Today, the genetic footprints of Celtic migrations are woven into the DNA of millions of people across Europe. Modern genetic studies continue to uncover the layers of this ancient heritage, revealing a story of movement, connection, and continuity that spans millennia. Whether through the bloodlines of ancient chieftains, the cultural echoes in language and art, or the genetic markers passed down through generations, the legacy of the Celts lives on, not just in history books, but in the very fabric of our DNA. When we think of the Celts, images of fierce warriors, mystical druids, and intricate knotwork often come to mind. But beneath the layers of legend and folklore lies an even more fascinating story, one etched not in stone or parchment, but within our very DNA. The tale of the Celts is not just one of battles and migrations, it's a story of families, communities, and traditions passed down through generations. And today, through the power of genetics, we can uncover how family structures, kinship, and social organization shaped Celtic societies, leaving an indelible mark on both their descendants and the cultures they touched. In traditional Celtic societies, family was the cornerstone of life. But what did family mean to the Celts? Was it simply about biological relationships, or did it extend beyond bloodlines? Genetic studies have begun to answer these questions, revealing the complex web of connections that bound Celtic communities together. One of the most striking discoveries comes from the analysis of ancient burial sites, where DNA has uncovered surprising insights into kinship patterns. Take, for example, the princely burials of the Hallstatt and Latin cultures, elaborate graves filled with treasures, weapons, and symbols of power. For a long time, archaeologists believed these burials were reserved for individuals who earned their status through personal achievements. However, genetic evidence tells a different story. DNA analysis from elite burial mounds in places like Eberdingen-Hauptdorf and Asperg-Grafenbuhl in southern Germany revealed that some of the individuals buried with great honors were closely related, specifically through maternal lines. In fact, one of the most compelling cases shows an avuncular relationship. A young man buried in a richly furnished grave was genetically linked to his maternal uncle, who was buried with equally prestigious artifacts. This suggests that power and leadership may have been passed down through the maternal line, highlighting the importance of maternal kinship in Celtic elite society. This matrilineal connection challenges the long-held belief that ancient European societies were strictly patriarchal. While men often held positions of political and military power, The genetic evidence indicates that women played a crucial role in maintaining dynastic continuity. In many cases, the maternal lineage was the thread that tied generations together, ensuring that family status and influence were preserved across time. But the story doesn't end with elite families. Genetic studies of more modest burial sites also reveal patterns of kinship that reflect broader social structures. In Iron Age Ireland, for instance, DNA from ancient cemeteries shows that communities were organized around extended family groups. Individuals buried close to one another often shared genetic markers, indicating they were part of the same family, even if their graves didn't display signs of wealth or status. This suggests that kinship was a fundamental organizing principle in Celtic society, influencing everything from settlement patterns to daily life. Another fascinating aspect uncovered by genetics is the practice of fosterage, a tradition deeply embedded in Celtic culture. Fosterage involved raising a child in a household other than their birth family, often to strengthen political alliances or social bonds. Historical texts from medieval Ireland describe fosterage as a common practice among the nobility, where children were sent to be raised by influential families, creating networks of loyalty and obligation. Genetic evidence supports the existence of this practice even in pre-Roman times. In some burial sites, children were found to have no close biological relationship to the adults they were buried with, despite being interred with the same level of care and ritual significance. This indicates that these children may have been fostered, treated as part of the family through social ties rather than blood. Such findings highlight the fluid nature of family in Celtic societies, where bonds of loyalty and kinship extended beyond mere genetics. Fosterage wasn't just about political strategy. It also played a role in cultural transmission. By growing up in different households, children were exposed to diverse customs, languages, and traditions, helping to spread cultural practices across regions. This may explain how certain Celtic artistic styles, religious beliefs, and social norms remained remarkably consistent across vast distances, from Ireland to Gaul to the Iberian Peninsula. Another layer of complexity in Celtic kinship structures comes from the role of women. Contrary to the image of male-dominated ancient societies, Celtic women often held significant social and economic power. This isn't just a romanticized notion from legends of warrior queens like Boudica. Genetic evidence and archaeological findings support the idea that women were central figures in both family and community life. In many elite burials, women were interred with grave goods that signified high status, jewelry, ceremonial items, and symbols of authority. DNA analysis has shown that these women often belonged to influential family lines, suggesting that their status was not merely a reflection of their husband's or father's position but stemmed from their own lineage. Moreover, in some cases, elite burials of women predate those of male family members, indicating that leadership roles may have been inherited through maternal lines. This focus on maternal ancestry is further supported by mitochondrial DNA studies. Unlike the Y chromosome, which is passed from father to son, mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively from the mother. By analyzing mitochondrial DNA from ancient remains, researchers can trace maternal lineages across generations. In Celtic regions, these studies reveal a surprising continuity of maternal lineages, even when paternal lines show signs of disruption due to migrations or conquests. This suggests that while political power may have shifted hands, the underlying social fabric, woven through maternal kinship, remained remarkably stable. Interestingly, the concept of family in Celtic societies wasn't limited to human relationships. The Celts had a profound connection to the land, often viewing it as an extension of their family lineage. This is reflected in the way they named places after ancestors, gods, or mythological figures, creating a landscape imbued with personal and collective history. Genetic studies of ancient populations show that many communities maintained deep-rooted ties to specific regions for thousands of years, reinforcing the idea that land and lineage were intimately connected. Moreover, the Celts' reverence for ancestry extended to their religious beliefs. Ancestor worship was a common practice, with rituals designed to honor the spirits of the dead and maintain a connection between the living and the departed. Burial mounds, or tumuli, served not only as graves but also as sacred sites where families could gather to pay tribute to their ancestors. The careful arrangement of bodies, grave goods, and ceremonial structures reflects a society deeply invested in preserving the memory and influence of past generations. Genetic data adds another dimension to this picture. In some burial sites, multiple generations of the same family were interred together, creating literal family trees beneath the earth. By sequencing the DNA of these individuals, researchers can reconstruct detailed genealogies, revealing how family ties influenced burial practices, social status, and even community organization. This biological continuity underscores the cultural importance of ancestry, showing that for the Celts, family wasn't just a social unit. It was a sacred bond that connected the past, present, and future. Another intriguing discovery comes from the analysis of inbreeding patterns, or rather, the lack thereof. In many ancient societies, elite families practiced close-kin marriages to preserve wealth and power within the family. However, genetic evidence from Celtic burial sites shows relatively low levels of inbreeding, even among the elite. This suggests that marriage alliances were often forged with individuals from outside the immediate family, possibly to strengthen political ties or maintain genetic diversity. In fact, marriage appears to have been a key tool for diplomacy in Celtic societies. Elite women were frequently married into influential families across different regions, creating networks of alliances that spanned vast distances. This practice is reflected in the genetic data, where individuals buried far from their place of origin show genetic markers linking them to distant populations. These long-distance connections help to knit together the Celtic world, fostering a sense of shared identity despite geographical separation. At the heart of all these discoveries is the realization that family, in Celtic culture, was more than just blood. It was about belonging to a lineage, a community, a landscape, and a tradition. Whether through maternal ancestry, fosterage, marriage alliances, or spiritual connections to the land, the Celts wove a rich tapestry of relationships that defined who they were and how they lived. Today, as we unlock the secrets of their DNA, we're not just learning about ancient genes, we're uncovering the stories of real people, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, friends and allies. Their lives may be distant in time, but their legacy lives on, etched into the very fabric of our genetic code, whispering the ancient truths of kinship, identity, and the enduring power of family. The Celts, often shrouded in the mists of mythology and history, were more than fierce warriors and mystical druids. Their story is woven deeply into the fabric of Europe, not just through archaeological remnants but within the very genes of their descendants. Modern genetic research has illuminated one of the most captivating aspects of Celtic life, the role of migration, mobility, and genetic continuity. These patterns reveal how the Celts moved across vast territories, connected distant communities, and preserved their cultural identity despite the tides of change. Imagine standing on the windswept cliffs of Ireland, gazing across the sea toward the distant coastlines of Spain and France. Thousands of years ago, Celtic ancestors embarked on journeys that would shape the genetic landscape of Europe. Their migrations were not random wanderings but part of complex networks of movement, driven by trade, exploration, conflict, and cultural exchange. Today, DNA acts as a time machine, allowing us to trace these ancient pathways and uncover stories hidden beneath the soil. One of the earliest insights into Celtic mobility comes from genetic studies of the Atlantic facade of Europe, stretching from northern Iberia through France, Britain, and Ireland. Y chromosome analysis, particularly of haplogroup R1b, reveals striking similarities between populations along this Atlantic corridor. This genetic signature suggests a shared ancestry that dates back to the post-Ice Age period, long before the rise of Celtic culture as we know it. But what does this mean for the Celts? It indicates that the people who would later be identified as Celts were part of a broader Atlantic community connected by maritime routes. These seafaring networks facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and, importantly, genes. As communities interacted, they blended cultural practices while maintaining distinct linguistic and social identities. This explains why Celtic languages and traditions emerged across such a wide geographic area, from Galicia in Spain to the Scottish Highlands. The Bronze Age, around 2500 to 800 BCE, was a period of significant movement across Europe, and the Celts were no exception. Archaeological evidence of the Beaker culture, named after its distinctive pottery, aligns with genetic data showing the spread of steppe-related ancestry into Western Europe. This genetic influx didn't erase existing populations but mixed with them, creating new cultural identities that would later be recognized as Celtic. Interestingly, while male lineages show signs of this steppe ancestry, mitochondrial DNA, passed down through mothers, remains remarkably consistent with earlier populations. This suggests that migrations were often male-dominated, with incoming men marrying local women. The blending of these lineages created the diverse yet connected genetic tapestry seen in Celtic regions today. Moving into the Iron Age, the period most closely associated with the Celts, genetic data reveals both continuity and change. In regions like southern Germany, the heartland of the Hallstatt culture, genome-wide studies show a mix of local ancestry with influences from across Europe. Some individuals buried in elite graves have genetic markers linking them to northern Italy and even Iberia, highlighting long-distance connections likely facilitated by trade and political alliances. But mobility wasn't limited to elites. Isotope analysis, which measures chemical signatures in human remains to determine geographic origin, shows that even individuals in modest burials often came from distant regions. For example, in Iron Age Britain, isotope data reveals people who grew up in continental Europe, suggesting regular movement across the English Channel. This challenges the idea of isolated Celtic tribes and paints a picture of dynamic, interconnected communities. One fascinating case comes from the burial site of Magdalenenburg in Germany. Genetic analysis identified a woman with ancestry tracing back to northern Italy. Yet she was buried among locals with no apparent distinction in grave goods. This suggests she was fully integrated into the community, reflecting the inclusive nature of Celtic societies where identity was shaped by cultural affiliation as much as by birthplace. Trade played a significant role in this mobility. The Celts were skilled metal workers, and their networks stretched across Europe, from the tin mines of Cornwall to the gold of the Carpathians. These trade routes were not just economic pathways but channels for genetic exchange. As merchants, artisans, and their families traveled, they brought their genes along with their goods, leaving traces of their heritage in distant lands. Migration wasn't always voluntary. The expansion of the Roman Empire forced many Celts to move, either through displacement or as part of the Roman military system. Genetic studies of Roman-era cemeteries in Britain show a diverse population with ancestry from across the empire, including regions with strong Celtic roots. This blending further enriched the genetic landscape, creating new layers of identity that persisted long after the fall of Rome. Despite all this movement, Celtic DNA also tells a story of remarkable continuity. In regions like Western Ireland and parts of Scotland, genetic signatures have remained relatively stable for thousands of years. This continuity reflects the enduring connection of Celtic communities to their ancestral lands, even as they engaged with broader European networks. One reason for this genetic stability is the importance of kinship and land in Celtic culture. Unlike societies that prioritized large-scale conquests and urbanization, the Celts often organized around clans and tribes rooted in specific territories. This deep attachment to the land meant that, even as individuals migrated, the core population maintained a strong genetic identity tied to place. Modern DNA studies also reveal surprising connections between distant Celtic regions. For example, genetic similarities between the Basque Country and Ireland suggest ancient links that predate Celtic culture but were preserved through shared ancestry and cultural continuity. This challenges simplistic narratives of Celtic origins and highlights the complex interplay of migration, adaptation, and tradition. In some cases, genetic outliers tell the most intriguing stories. For instance, an Iron Age burial in Dorset, England, revealed a young boy with DNA more closely related to populations in Central Europe. His grave goods, however, were distinctly British, indicating that while his ancestry traced to foreign lands, he was fully assimilated into local culture. Such cases illustrate how identity in Celtic societies was fluid, shaped by both heritage and environment. The decline of the Celtic world in the face of Roman conquest and later Germanic migrations did not erase these genetic footprints. Instead, they became part of the rich mosaic of European ancestry. In fact, many modern Europeans carry traces of Celtic DNA, whether through direct descent or the blending of ancient lineages over time. Today, advances in genetic research continue to uncover new chapters in the story of Celtic mobility. Projects like the People of the British Isles study have mapped fine-scale genetic variation across the UK, revealing patterns that align with ancient tribal boundaries and historical migrations. These studies show that while political borders have shifted, the genetic echoes of the past remain embedded in the population. Celtic DNA doesn't just reflect where people came from. It tells us how they lived, connected, and adapted. It reveals a world of movement and exchange, where identity was both inherited and created through the dynamic flow of people and cultures. Far from being static tribes isolated in remote regions, the Celts were part of a vibrant, interconnected European tapestry. Understanding this genetic legacy helps us appreciate the resilience of Celtic traditions. Despite waves of migration, conquest, and cultural change, the core elements of Celtic identity, language, art, mythology, and social structure, endured. This endurance is not just a testament to cultural pride but also to the deep biological roots that tie the present to the ancient past. In the end, the story of Celtic migration and mobility is one of both change and continuity. Through the lens of DNA, we see not just the movements of people but the persistence of traditions that have shaped the identity of Europe for millennia. Celtic DNA reveals a fascinating story of migration, mobility, and genetic continuity across Europe. From the Atlantic coasts of Ireland to the heartlands of Central Europe, the Celts were part of dynamic networks shaped by trade, exploration, and cultural exchange. Genetic evidence shows both the far-reaching connections of Celtic communities and the deep roots they maintained in their ancestral lands. Despite waves of migration, conquest, and cultural shifts, the core of Celtic identity endured, reflected not just in language and traditions but also in the very DNA of their descendants. This enduring legacy connects the ancient past to the present, illustrating how the movements of people and the resilience of culture have shaped Europe's genetic landscape.